It was an ordinary afternoon in the bustling city when two officers spotted an elderly woman sitting on the sidewalk, her clothes worn and her posture tired. Instead of offering help, they exchanged smirks and began to mock her, their words laced with condescension. To them, she was just another poor black woman who didn't belong. Passers-by noticed the scene but hesitated to intervene. The woman sat quietly, her dignity intact, as if she knew something the officers didn't. Then, a car pulled up, and out stepped a young man who radiated confidence and purpose. He approached with calm authority, his presence commanding attention. The officers, caught off guard, quickly realized they might have made a mistake. Who was this man? And why was he here? What happened next would leave the officers regretting their actions and teach everyone watching a lesson they'd never forget. The young man walked straight to the elderly woman, kneeling beside her with a look of deep concern. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with care. The officers, now standing awkwardly nearby, exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected anyone to come for her, let alone someone like him. His sharp suit and calm demeanor made it clear he wasn't someone to be taken lightly. As he helped his mother to her feet, the officers tried to shift the tone, nervously cracking jokes to ease the tension. But the man didn't even look at them. Instead, he turned to his mother, asking her if she needed anything. She nodded quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Onlookers began to gather, sensing something unusual was unfolding. The officers, now clearly out of their depth, were starting to realize they had underestimated the woman and her son. The crowd around them began to grow, with whispers spreading about what was happening. Some people pulled out their phones to record, sensing that this moment was more than it seemed. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Sir, is there a problem here?" one of them asked, forcing a smile. But the man's steady gaze made it clear he wasn't intimidated. Without raising his voice, he said, "The problem is how you treated my mother. Do you think this is how people deserve to be treated?" His words hit like a thunderclap, silencing everyone nearby. The officers fumbled for a response, but the man's calm authority left them unsure how to proceed. Meanwhile, the elderly woman, still holding her son's arm, looked at him with quiet pride. She hadn't said much, but her presence spoke volumes. Something about her silence made the officers squirm even more, as if they knew they had crossed a line they couldn't erase. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Yeah, explain yourselves." More voices joined in, adding to the growing tension. The officers suddenly found themselves not just dealing with the man and his mother, but also the watchful eyes of the people around them. The younger officer, now clearly nervous, stammered, "We didn't mean anything by it. We were just trying to, lighten the mood." But his words only made the crowd more restless. The murmurs grew louder, and the tension in the air became almost tangible. The man took a step forward, his calm exterior unwavering. "Lighten the mood? By mocking someone who's done nothing wrong? By disrespecting my mother?" His voice carried a quiet strength, each word striking like a hammer. The officers glanced around, realizing they were outnumbered not just by the crowd, but by the truth of their actions. The older officer tried to take control. "Look, we didn't know who she was. Let's not blow this out of proportion," he said, his tone sharp. The man didn't flinch. "You didn't know who she was, but you assumed she was less than you. That's the problem." The crowd murmured in agreement, their support now firmly behind the man and his mother. The elderly woman finally spoke, her voice calm, but filled with quiet strength. "All my life, I've been treated like I don't matter. But my son made sure I never believed that." Her words hung in the air, carrying the weight of generations of struggle. The officers looked visibly shaken, their bravado crumbling. The crowd inched closer, phones capturing every moment. All eyes were on the man, his mother, and the officers, as the tension built to a boiling point. Just as the weight of the moment seemed to settle, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A man in a sharp uniform stepped out, his presence commanding instant attention. It was the precinct captain. The crowd buzzed with curiosity, sensing something big was about to happen. The officers froze, their faces pale. They hadn't called for backup, and the captain's arrival wasn't a coincidence. He walked toward the scene, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on the elderly woman and her son. "Mrs. Daniels," he said with a respectful nod, his tone formal and almost reverent. "I didn't expect to see you here." The officers exchanged panicked looks, their confusion clear. Why was the captain addressing her with such respect? The son, now visibly calm but firm, nodded toward the captain. "They didn't recognize her," he said simply, his words laced with meaning. The captain turned to the officers, his expression hardening. "Do you two have any idea who you've just disrespected?" he asked, his voice sharp and cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The officers stammered, but no words came out. The captain's gaze was unrelenting as he gestured toward the woman. "This is Mrs. Daniels, a woman who spent her life giving back to this community, even when she had nothing. She's one of the most respected people in this city." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The crowd gasped, and the officers looked as if the ground had been pulled out from under them. The stakes had shifted, and it was clear this wasn't just about their actions anymore. It was about the values they had failed to uphold. The son stepped closer, his voice calm but resolute. "You judged her by what you saw, not by who she is, and now you'll face the consequences." The tension was palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The captain's words left the officers speechless, their arrogance crumbling as the weight of their actions sank in. The crowd, emboldened by the truth, began to voice their anger, demanding accountability. The elderly woman, however, raised her hand, quieting everyone with a simple gesture. "I don't need revenge," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "What I need is for people to see each other as human beings, not as stereotypes, not as assumptions." Her son turned to the captain. "They should face the consequences, but my mother has taught me compassion. Let this moment be a lesson, not just for them, but for everyone here." The captain nodded, his respect for Mrs. Daniels evident. Turning to the officers, he said firmly, "You're going to apologize. Not because you were caught, but because it's the right thing to do." The officers, now humbled and visibly shaken, stepped forward. "We're sorry," the younger one said, his voice trembling. "We made a mistake, and we'll do better." The apology felt raw, imperfect, but genuine. The crowd watched in silence, their phones still recording, as the officers faced the consequences of their actions under the weight of the community's judgment. Just as the tension seemed to ease, Mrs. Daniels smiled faintly and said, "You know, life has a way of surprising you." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded newspaper. She handed it to the captain, who opened it and froze. It was an article about her, highlighting her life's work, her struggles, and her triumphs. Her son smiled knowingly. "She's not just my mother, she's a hero." The crowd erupted into applause, the mood shifting from anger to admiration. The officers, now fully grasping the gravity of their actions, stood in silent reflection. The moment wasn't just about punishment. It became a turning point, a reminder that kindness and understanding could rewrite any story. As the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Daniels looked at her son, pride shining in her eyes. "You stood up for me," she said quietly. "Now, let's stand up for each other." As the crowd dispersed, the energy in the air shifted. People who had stopped to watch left with a new perspective, quietly reflecting on what they had just witnessed. The officers, still standing by, looked humbled and thoughtful, clearly processing the weight of their actions. The captain nodded at Mrs. Daniels and her son, his expression one of deep respect. "You've reminded us all of what we're here to do, serve with dignity," he said before walking back to his car. Mrs. Daniels looked up at her son, her warm smile breaking through the tension of the day. "It's not about what happens to us," she said, her voice steady. "It's about how we rise above it." He nodded, taking her hand as they walked away together. In that moment, the city didn't feel as cold. It felt like a place where change was possible, one act of courage at a time.